Hey, DawgNation, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're in a bit of a mood today. It's about that time of year where I need to get concerned about a couple things when it comes to Georgia's recruiting class. After all, that's kind of a tradition at this point in time. So we'll do some of that with Jeff Sintel today as a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All. I am also quite upset with Florida coach Dan Mullen. Nothing new about that. So we'll take some jabs at him on today's show. But I want to start with what I think is some good news. A chance that a Georgia player who's already made quite a name for himself could put himself in a historic class by the end of the year. This is a fun way to begin on what's going to be a loaded show for us. We're glad you're with us. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Probably my favorite way to pass time during the offseason is ripping on Florida coach Dan Mullen. We've got a great opportunity to do that here today, and there are a couple pretty significant recruiting storylines I need to cover with Jeff Sintel, so we'll get to all that coming up on the program in just a couple of minutes. Let me begin, though, with this, what I thought was a really interesting exchange on Twitter yesterday. Mike Griffith, our own from DawgNation, was promoting some of his work on Twitter. I'll show you his tweet where he says, hey, there's some questions for the Georgia offensive line this season heading into spring practice, and no doubt that's true, even though this is an elite body right now, probably the best offensive line on paper Georgia's ever had. Mike's probably right and fair to say there are some questions about how so-and-so is going to be replaced, Lamont Gilliard maybe in particular, and some of the other issues. And somebody had, or at least an entity had seen Mike's tweet on that and added a little more context to the situation involving Georgia's offensive line. Now, I thought this was really interesting. It comes from the Football Writers Association of America. That's the kind of group that would never allow me to be a member, but certainly they're interesting with some of their takes on certain things. And so they retweeted Mike when it comes to the Georgia offensive line and added this, and I do think this is kind of interesting. The Football Writers Association says Georgia has not had an Outland Trophy recipient. Now, the Outland Trophy is an award that goes to the best interior lineman each year, offensive or defensive. Georgia hasn't had a guy win this award since 1968 when the great Bill Stanfill won it. The Football Writers go on to say he is the Bulldogs' only winner. Alabama's had 5 recipients since 1999, which is an amazing performance by the Crimson Tide, no doubt. And then the Football Writers go on to say that 4 of those Alabama winners have been on the offensive line. Will this be Georgia's year? Then there's a whole thing about vaccines and flu, and I don't really know what any of that has to do with anything. I don't know if that's spam or what, but the overall point that Georgia has not had an Outland Trophy winner since 68. Alabama's had a bunch of them. Georgia trying to keep pace with Alabama. Could this be the year that Georgia does that? Now, I think this is interesting for 2 reasons. Georgia has had national award winners the last 2 seasons. DeAndre Baker won the Thorpe Award last season. Roquan Smith won the Buckus Award the season before that. I think there's a real cachet to Georgia when you have national award winners like that. I think it makes the program look cool in the moment, but it also sets the stage for the next generation of player to want to follow in those footsteps. There'll be defensive backs that choose Georgia because of DeAndre Baker. There'll be linebackers already that have chosen Georgia because of Roquan Smith. And if Georgia indeed produces a lineman like that this year, the way the Football Writers Association suggests, that'll no doubt open the door for more recruitment for Georgia. Now, the obvious point here is that if Georgia does produce one of those Outland Trophy winners this year for the first time in a long time, I think it stands to reason that the most likely candidate for that is Georgia's left tackle, Andrew Thomas. He's already made a name for himself, but he could be ready to take the next step with his development, and that could make big news for Georgia and pave a trail for even more success for the program. Now, a lot of you are aware of Thomas's credentials, but it's probably worth pointing out a little bit more here. We talked yesterday on the show about the fact that Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm was at that symposium running concurrently to the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis. They were kind of held off, according to ESPN, away from the watchful eye of the press. You couldn't really see them. You wouldn't really know they were there, but they were there learning about what it's going to take to be the next great NFL draft pick and how to make that transition successful. Jake Fromm was one of the Georgia players there. Andrew Thomas was the other, because the odds are, assuming Thomas stays healthy, and I guess maybe even if he doesn't, it's hard to imagine Thomas won't be drafted very high in next year's NFL draft as a junior leaving early. That means when Georgia fans watch Georgia this season, they're going to be watching one of the 5 or 10 best players in the entire country at his position. It's Andrew Thomas. NFL riches are coming his way, but also another one of those national awards could be coming too. In a lot of ways, it's really kind of the culmination of what has been a complete and total transformation of the Georgia offensive line since Kirby Smart became the head coach of this program. I think one of the blights on the Mark Richt era was maybe not enough of an emphasis on great offensive linemen, and the Georgia program, I think, kind of suffered because of that. But since Kirby Smart's been here, since Sam Pittman's been here, it has been a total transformation, and Thomas has been the leader of that. So it seemed fitting that he might get honored with another national award for the program at the end of the season. And by the way, speaking of that transformation of the Georgia offensive line, apparently this is something that Thomas takes really seriously, because as he gets ready to go into his 3rd season as a starter, let's go back to Thomas at the beginning of what was going to be his 2nd season last year as a sophomore. Thomas was a big believer that the Georgia reputation needed to be changed, apparently, and he wanted to be the catalyst for doing just that. His words then prove prophetic now. Here's Andrew Thomas.
Well, we just tried to change the culture, and basically we just play physical every day. And it starts in practice. We practice hard every day. It starts with our O-line coach, Coach Pittman, and he just pushes us to be the best we can be.
I love that very succinct, simple quote from Andrew Thomas. We want to be known as a physical offensive line. We want to change the culture around here. That starts with me. It's led by Sam Pittman, and it's on the field, on display for everybody in America to see. There's no denying that's been the case for Georgia. As Georgia moves into 2019 as a legitimate national championship threat and contender, the offensive line is the biggest reason why, and the elite nature of the offensive line, the guy most responsible for that is Andrew Thomas. So if the Outland Trophy's out there and available to be won, I, for one, would love to see Thomas bring it home. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you. Thanks for being with us. Live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio at noon as well, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and in podcast form, wherever you find podcasts. We also post the show each day at the world-famous DawgNation.com. Thanks for checking us out today. Later on in today's show, we shall have another opportunity for a Road to Atlanta t-shirt giveaway. Now, I'll announce yesterday's winner and tell you how you can win the t-shirt for today. That's all coming up later today on DawgNation Daily as a part of Road to Atlanta. Really fun stuff there. It's Jeff Sintel here in a couple of minutes, too, as a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All. And for those of you that may have missed this, Jeff and I had a chance to be chefs last week, and it was really fun. I completely dominated Jeff in an online campaign and a survey vote, if you will. I came away a big winner. I'll gloat about that coming up with Jeff in a couple of minutes. There are also some really serious recruiting issues we need to get into with Mr. Sintel, so we'll do all that coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, and I mentioned this off the top, got to take a little bit of umbrage with our buddy Florida coach Dan Mullen. Now, I'm going to talk about one thing, and this is going to kind of lead us into something else that's been on my mind a bit too, but all of this I think is really important as spring practice gets going around the SEC and people start to formulate their opinions what the 2019 season is going to be about. I have never seen a coach like Mullen use a Peach Bowl victory and allow that to go to his head as much as Mullen treats what happened for Florida at the end of last year as if he's some sort of conquering hero. A guy that's never won either of the two SEC divisions and the entire time that he's been an SEC coach all of a sudden feels like that he is of such a dignified status that he ought to be giving advice to other coaches. Well, my simple advice to Mullen would be, how about you worry about coaching your own team? But nonetheless, Mullen was generous enough to share his thoughts on quarterback recruitment. Thomas Goldkamp, a reporter on hand as Mullen was speaking. I guess this is a way of kind of kicking off Florida spring practice. But here's what Mullen says about quarterback recruiting. He says, I think we did a poor job recruiting if guys were coming in and then immediately walking out the door because it was something different than they thought it would be, and we lied to them during recruiting. Or we sold them on a dream that wasn't true. Now, Thomas Goldkamp's inference here is the same as many other people's are. The Florida reporter, he says, Dan Mullen on transfers. Is this a Justin Fields reference or nah? So, obviously, for most people, they're going to take this as a Justin Fields reference, and most people are going to take this as a jab against Kirby Smart. Now, we don't know for sure what Mullen's thinking, but it's also not that hard to read between the lines when it comes to something like this. Now, this makes me mad for a couple of reasons. First of all, on the subject of Mullen giving advice to Kirby Smart when it comes to how he handled Justin Fields last year. Have you seen Mullen lately when it comes to quarterbacks? Because let's not pretend that he didn't do everything he could to get in the door with Justin Fields, going to take a visit with him, so much so that he angered the quarterback commit that he did have, Matt Corral. Corral's now at Ole Miss. So Mullen went down the line a long way with Justin Fields, only to get the Heisman, the stiff arm from Mullen, and basically get, shut out and locked down. He took the L there in that recruitment. And then he brings in Emory Jones, who we should not forget was a pretty high quarterback recruit. One-time Ohio State commit, flirted a little bit with Alabama, ends up signing with Florida. Now, listen, on this program, I go out of my way not to say bad things about players, even players that don't play for Georgia, even players that play for those lousy, stinking Gators. I don't rip on players here on this show. But when Emory Jones played this season, it left a lot to be desired. There are times that he didn't look much like a quarterback, to be honest with you. So while Mullen's giving advice to Kirby Smart about how he should have handled Justin Fields, how about you develop Emory Jones? You're supposed to be some sort of quarterback whisperer. How about you whisper something to Emory Jones that make him not look like a converted defensive back when he's on the football field? That would be my advice to Dan Mullen when it comes to that. But then even on the subject of Justin Fields alone, can we treat players as if they need to bear a little bit of the responsibility, the burden of the responsibility for their own decisions? Mullen wants to say that Georgia was completely in the wrong about handling the Justin Fields situation. I myself have said before that Georgia ought to be asking itself privately some tough questions about what really did go on there, and is there something that Georgia could have done to avoid what now seems like a little bit of a controversy. But while I'll say that about Georgia, the one thing that I won't deny is that Fields himself, who I got no beef against, but Fields himself has a little bit of individual responsibility, or maybe even a lot of individual responsibility for the choice that he made. Because here's what we know. As Fields was on his way to Georgia, really close, well-credentialed advisors were advising him not to do this. And Fields apparently didn't want to listen, and Fields apparently chose to come to Georgia anyway. Dan Mullen doesn't tell you that with his public remarks, but we know that's true. Now you say, B.A., how do you know that's true? Because one of them told us. Trent Dilfer, I'm assuming a close confidant of Justin Fields because he worked with him at the Elite 11 quarterback camp. He's the noted quarterback guru, the head coach of that camp. He told us back in January, or I guess very early February, that he told Fields that going to Georgia was just a bad idea. Here is Trent Dilfer.
I told Justin I didn't think it was a good move to go there. He's a unique talent, one of the best I've ever seen, but these kids, they think that when they're in high school, they're just going to go in and beat out the stud that's ahead of them. And Jake's a great player. And Jake's a guy that not only a great player, but he's a player that gets the most out of everybody, and people gravitate towards him. So the dual thing was never going to work, having the two quarterbacks splitting time. And Jake, because of his command of the offense and the success he had as a freshman, to me, I just didn't think it was a good move.
Yeah, so listen, when it's all said and done, there was a competition at quarterback at Georgia, the likes of which Dan Mullen could only dream of being able to generate with his program. He simply doesn't have enough depth to do that. And Justin Fields, for as talented as he is and as much fun as he is to watch, he took the L to Jake Fromm. Now, speaking of taking L's to Jake Fromm, that's also something that Dan Mullen knows a good bit about as well. And that's the other thing that bothers me about all of this, is all of a sudden Dan Mullen, on the heels of a Peach Bowl victory over, I guess, Jim Harbaugh in Michigan in a top 10 ranking, all of a sudden he feels like he kind of arrives on the scene now as a force to be reckoned with Florida in the SEC. And I think, his statements about all of this stuff and how allegedly Kirby Smart should handle his transfer quarterbacks is sort of built on the idea that Florida's back and the Gators are back and there's a little bit of swagger down there in Gainesville. And obviously the national media, I think, helps generate some of this kind of stuff and get you excited if you're a Florida fan about some of this kind of stuff. But let me promise you and tell you, it is all, for the most part, wishful thinking. But seeing Mullen do all of this just brings to mind some of the stuff that I've been seeing as of late about how this Florida-Georgia rivalry is back. And the Gators are going to be a thorn in Georgia's side once again. Dennis Dodd, CBS Sports, trying to tout this as the rise of the SEC East. He says, why you weren't looking, the SEC's other division, he means the East, got its manhood back. Dan Mullen brought hope back to Gainesville, Florida, with 10 wins in his first season. And he goes on to say, basically, this is going to lift, the fortunes in the entire division. I hate to tell Mr. Dodd this, but the SEC East as a division isn't rising so much as Georgia, who's won every division game the last 2 years by 14 or more points, is the one that's really continuing to be on the rise. It's not the SEC East. But not to be outdone by that was Bill Bender from the Sporting News, who also recently touted Florida in the pages of a national website. Bill writes that Florida's got a blockbuster opener against Miami, then Tennessee and Auburn before back-to-back road games against LSU and South Carolina before the matchup against the Bulldogs. Dan Mullen built a bunch of momentum in Gainesville last season. If they beat Georgia this season, the Gators will represent the SEC East in Atlanta. Essentially, what Bender's telling you there is that he thinks that Florida's going to be at least 7-1 coming into that game. And I also, although I like Bill Bender, think that's a bunch of bunk too. Now you may say, BA, well, why would you be so quick to dismiss Florida and its ability to challenge Georgia in the SEC East here in 2019? For two reasons. First of all, because I know what Georgia's all about, seeing the recruiting success it's had the last 3 seasons. In comparison to Florida, the chasm is as wide now as it's ever been. And more important than that, when it comes to sitting here in this chair and doing this show every single day, we have been down this road before. We have been in this same spot a year ago. The same way Dennis Dodd and Bill Bender and others are saying, look out SEC East, Florida's back. This division's deep and challenging for Georgia in a way that it wasn't back in 2017. This same thing happened a year ago. Another guy that I like, Pete Futak from College Football News, came on this program and essentially tried to make the same case but the SEC East a year ago. Here's Futak from then.
Tennessee and Florida, kind of the same boat, different thing. Tennessee's going to be better. You know, they're not going to win the SEC East, but they're going to at least not be a speed bump like they were last year. And they did have their chances. You know, if they didn't lose, you know, on that last second throw, you know, to Florida, and they had a couple of, other close calls along the way, and then they just melted down obviously at the end. But there's enough talent there where they could be a danger. Florida, I do think, can flip that switch quickly. Remember, you know, they did go to 2 straight SEC championships under Jim McElwain. So there's enough there where if you get the right formula on the right day, they can absolutely rise up and rock just that one day in a cocktail party where they can pull off that, you know, that upset win. They could be good enough under Mullen to just have that tweak offensively right out of the gate.
Let me remind you, that was last year, before the season in which Georgia would go on to obliterate the East once again, including beating Florida by 19 points. All of this stuff is wishful thinking. The media does not want the SEC East to be boring, therefore they talk up Florida. And Dan Mullen believes his own hype. That's what leads him to start giving Kirby Smart advice about how to handle quarterbacks. But this year in Jacksonville, I believe the results are going to be the same they've been the last 2 years. It was McElwain in 2017. It was Mullen last year. 2019 will be Mullen again. But the gap is still just as wide. It's an easy Georgia win. It's an easy coasting for Georgia in the SEC East. And my guess is Kirby might rub Mullen's face in it just a little bit for trying to tell him how he should handle his quarterbacks. All right, DawgNation Daily, good to have you here. Fun stuff. Road to Atlanta T-shirts later on. There is some important recruiting stuff to get into with Jeff Sintel. So as a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All, let's do that right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, Jeff, later on, here's part of our Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All. I thought it'd be really fun to go back and look at our experience at Marlowe's last week, where we had a terrific time at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven. They rolled out the red carpet for us. Chef's jackets, chef coats. We really got the old treatment. Huge tasting experience with a lot of the great staples on the chef-inspired Marlowe's menu. But we also got a chance to cook up our own creme brulee, or at least heat it up and put that little fiery char coating on the outside of it. I thought might be fun to walk back and take a look at that before we're done. But if you do not mind, we have some serious stuff to get to before we get into any fun and games. Is that fair here on this Tuesday?
Yeah, man, let's not overcook the brulee, man. Let's get right to it.
All right, so let me start with this. Rakeem Jarrett, the 5-star wide receiver, guy that we've talked about a lot, put out a very interesting tweet recently where it looks like that he's getting ready to make some sort of commitment decision. He put this out on Twitter. In fact, I think we have that for people to see. Yeah, he says, Rakeem Jarrett, commitment coming soon. He's got the party emoji. He's excited about that. Now, Jeff, I said this to our video audience before our show began today that here we are kind of mid-March. This is about the time where I usually kind of get worked up and worried about something when it comes to Georgia's upcoming recruiting class. So we're kind of right on schedule for that. But Jarrett saying commitment coming soon on the heels of what I believe was a visit to Tennessee this past weekend. Does that give a Georgia fan, or should that give a Georgia fan, reason for some pause and some concern?
All right, Brandon, let's have fun with this. Let's do some interactive D&D with BA. You remember those old Choose Your Own Adventure books growing up?
Oh, yeah,
well,
absolutely.
Here's a couple of ways you can take this one. The first one, commitment coming soon. Now, first of all, these young men are not authors. They don't get paid to tweet for a living, of course, but perhaps, and this is the first theory I'll proffer, the first theory was that, which was even, I guess, circulated by the DawgNation forum, perhaps Rakeem Jarrett is not talking about his own commitment, but perhaps another commitment. That's option A. Let's call that turn to page 47. Option B is, he's about to commit. He's taking a couple of trips to Tennessee that wowed him, taking a trip to Georgia as well that wowed him. Lots of schools are in the mix. He's always been a long-standing Ohio State type guy, and lots of folks thought he would eventually end up in Columbus. Number three could possibly mean none of the above right now. Maybe it's option A, option B, or even the third thing, which is, I guess, another thing you got to consider here as well with Rakeem Jarrett, is that the definition of the term soon, because also on social media, I'm sure you saw the initial tweet, but he also said, when a lot of folks said, well, you haven't visited Clemson, so there's no way you're going to Clemson. And then Rakeem Jarrett said that, there's no way I'm committing until I see Clemson. So the road's less traveled, Brandon. Which one of those seems right to you?
Yeah, I think it's difficult for me to say. I guess the reason why I bring up the Tennessee part of this is if you were to ask me which non-UGA assistant might be the most interesting or important to watch when it comes to the recruiting battles over the next couple of years, I might say T. Martin, who's the wide receivers coach now at Tennessee, and I'll tell you why I feel that way. Because we know the Vols going to recruit well defensively. They've got a really good recruiting-minded defensive staff. But on the offensive side of the ball with Jim Chaney, we know he's not going to recruit. He doesn't leave his office. I don't really know yet about Chris Winkie as a recruiter. I think he's probably a pretty good coach, and he's got ties to IMG. I'm not quite sure about him as a recruiter just yet. But Martin does have a history of signing five-star guys. He's been at programs where that's a expectation, and he himself has shown an ability to do that. He's also kind of lost some of the shine off of his reputation because of the way that it ends for him at USC. So he's a little bit of a swing candidate here. But he's one of those guys I think if you're a Georgia fan, coaching receivers at Tennessee, you do got to pay a little bit of attention to, because if he gives the Vols a recruiting presence on the offensive side of the ball, that's how Jeremy Pruitt goes from being not bowl eligible to all of a sudden maybe being a little bit of a speed bump on Georgia's pathway towards multiple national championships.
So I like that answer, Brandon. I think that, we talk about that topic, current recruiter at another program, a rival program to be on the watch for. I thought Tennessee staff, but I didn't think T. Martin. I thought Derek Ansley. I thought the coordinator of the Volunteers. I think he's going to be a head coach in like 2 or 3 years. I think he's that confident at simply the job of defensive coordinator, but I think bigger things down the road as well. The other guys that I would think about would probably be Brandon Streeter at Clemson, and also Jeff Scott at Clemson as well. I'm sure you're going to get to the big news from yesterday, but
sure.
That was a nice win for Clemson with Mitchell Mays as they picked up 4-star offensive lineman Mitchell Mays last night. And now Clemson, I guess they're trying to build a great wall of South Carolina, let's call it maybe. They've got 4 2020 offensive line commitments already for that class, and they're going to have a lot of guys turn over protecting Trevor Lawrence over the next 2 years.
So before I get to the Mitchell Mays news, a guy that we have talked about a good bit recently, it sounds like if I'm reading between the lines on you're saying, listen, it's not over for Rakeem Jarrett until he has a chance to explore the Clemson situation. So it sounds like that concern that Georgia fans have been growing with Clemson for a lot of elite recruits, it sounds like that's not going out of style in terms of this conversation really either, is it?
I think this is going to be everybody sees these max effort lists on social media and Twitter. I think everybody saw, recently I think Cooper Mays, the younger brother of Cade Mays, is already pushing up like 430 on the bench, making it look quite easy. Well, I think Clemson's going to have their max lift in this recruiting class. I think Clemson has the potential to do something impressive, but maybe dastardly inside the mind of Brandon Adams. So they might sign 4 or 5 of the nation's top 10 players this year. And there's going to be a push. There's going to be a push somewhere in this year, in this recruiting cycle, where there's going to be some names like a 5-star quarterback, a 5-star receiver that all pop to Clemson all about around the same time. And there's going to be a lot of big momentum for the Tigers. And then it's just going to be kind of the bar has been raised, and let's see if the Georgia Bulldogs can meet that challenge and kind of sign a big class of their own, just like the Clemson Tigers are going through this cycle.
You know what would be a very scary thought, Jeff, for the rest of college football? Can you imagine if Clemson signed that kind of haul, that collection of elite top 10 talent, get them all jacked up with Osterine? Can you imagine how dangerous Clemson's going to be then?
Really, like they're going for that rigorous ACC schedule, Brandon. That's simply all it is.
So let's talk about one of the gets that Clemson did have. And, I don't really know how good of a player this young man is yet, but it's a guy that, just given your profiles of him at DawgNation.com, I've grown to like. That's Mitchell Mays, the versatile offensive lineman from North Carolina, a state that's been good to UGA as of late. But Mays jumps on the Clemson opportunity and does commit to Clemson. For the folks watching on video, we'll show you his happy smiles about being in the orange and purple. And, Jeff, given the fact they've only signed like 7 offensive linemen the last 2 years, I didn't know Clemson still recruited offensive linemen. So it's partially interesting to know that they're actually still in the game for offensive linemen. But beyond that, what does it mean to you that a Mays jumps on the opportunity at Clemson?
Well, he had lots of love for Clemson early, and also North Carolina. And then he caught wind of the Power G a little bit, was really appreciating Georgia, was going to give him an official, was going to come back for G-Day. And now that kind of all changed, and now that you're a Clemson recruit, you don't expect to take any official visits elsewhere. But with, and I guess big picture is the thing, and Georgia fans probably need to get a good sense of this right now. It's kind of some of the stuff we're talking on the DawgNation forum, is I can project, how much did Georgia need Mitchell Mays? Georgia saw him as a across the front offensive lineman. He can play center, he can play guard, he can play tackle. But in reality, the only person that I think that Georgia's recruiting in the 2020 class right now that sees playing time at Georgia quick might be a Broderick Jones, might be a Tate Ratledge up in Rome. But this is how stacked Georgia is on the offensive line. Georgia could lose 3 or 4 guys to the NFL draft in 2019. They could also lose 3 or 4 more guys to the NFL draft in 2020, and yet the Bulldogs would still be able to put out an offensive line that has 4 guys that are either All-American types or guys that went to the Nike opening final showcase as well. So think about that attrition, Brandon. 7 guys go off to the NFL in 2 years, and yet Georgia might still have a line that looks like Broderick Jones, Owen Condon, Clay Webb, Warren McClendon, Xavier Truss, guys like that. So tremendous what Georgia's doing, and I think Georgia is definitely going to recruit from a position of strength right now on its offensive line. And, very interesting really late for Mitchell Mays. I talked to him after his decision, and that was kind of supposed to be his timeline, which he was going to name a top 5 and cut down his schools. But he got to Clemson, and I'm sure he saw what the board looked like and saw what the spots looked like, and he decided he needed no more time to wait, and he pulled the trigger on committing to Clemson. Nice little bibliography to the Mitchell Mays recruiting story, at least for DawgNation. As he said, second place was either Auburn or North Carolina. So those 2 schools, they definitely need offensive linemen more than Georgia had. I really came on strong there in the end.
Yeah, I agree with you. Your initial take on this, which is that Georgia's certainly not desperate for offensive linemen, which maybe sort of left the inability to develop a deep connection with Mays because of other programs who just need him a lot more than Georgia does. But beyond that, one of the things you and I have talked a pretty good bit about is the the way in which Georgia and Clemson recruit differently. And I guess here's one of the things that makes the Clemson process and all this a little bit difficult to compete with and combat against, where if a player committed to another school, now in this case, Georgia may not really want Mitchell Mace, but let's just keep this as just a generic conversation, that you always have the hope of, well, maybe you circle back and you win that recruiting battle in the end, that Georgia's going to keep chasing and Georgia's going to keep fighting. But when it comes to the Clemson situation, and Andrew Booth comes to mind a year ago, that once a guy goes to Clemson, because Clemson recruits so few players and because Clemson just kind of, does all of this in just a very different way, I mean, the chances of ever flipping a guy from Clemson are just a lot more difficult. And I guess that's the closest to a compliment I can give the Tigers and Dabo Swinney, but they are probably the hardest program to flip a player from right now, way more so than Alabama, because we've seen Georgia flip players from Alabama and almost, do a few more. It's hard to flip a player from Clemson because Clemson targets so few recruits, correct?
Yeah, and the other thing, Brandon, is I think they're, for all of the grins and giggles, I think the way Clemson does it is a very classy way to do it. It's a very old school way to do it. And that's a program where a lot of people throw around the word genuine, but I think a lot of times genuine does apply to the Clemson Tigers. And they've also got the street cred where they're able to, they've got a reputation, and it is well deserved. It was almost like that other team in orange. They talk a little bit like maybe the Clemson Tigers perform and back it up on the field, and yet you don't hear any of the bravado out of the Clemson Tigers and Dabo world when it comes to the things they do. I mean, Brendan, real quickly, I just looked at the top 15, and if I had to put markers or bet Dr. Peppers or Coca-Colas on it right now, I can see a legitimate scenario where Georgia and Clemson, the combination of those two schools, end up with at least half of the top 15 players in the country for 2020. So that's just something to think about.
That's an amazing foreshadowing for what could to come. It's the Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All here with the Jeff Sintel on DawgNation Daily. And we did have a great time last week at being at Marlowe's, a chance to sample a lot of that chef-inspired food. And we were lucky enough to have, a lot of menu items kind of come out our way, whether it be shrimp and grits or the French dip or the delicious chicken club or, some of the great cocktails. And when you sample a lot of the different menu items, you really see what goes into each and every one of those items. Taking the care to make each individual ingredient, kind of plussing it, making it, better than it would. Fried capers, for instance, taste better than just regular, generic run-of-the-mill capers. When you mix that into the ingredients and on the recipe, on the entree, all of a sudden you've got an entirely different taste experience. Chefs think differently, and chef-inspired food at Marlowe's is going to kind of come to you differently. It was a great experience for us, and one of the reasons why we're such big fans of Marlowe's. We hope you'll check out the Marlowe's in your neighborhood. Text the word Marlowe's, MARLOWS, to 24242. You can become a Marlowe's insider. When big events are happening at the tavern right there in your neighborhood, you'll know about them. You'll also be the first to hear about special offers from Marlowe's Tavern as well, so please make sure you check that out. Okay, a couple things I want to do real quickly, Jeff, before we show our video from last week, kind of some fun stuff. Brock Vandegrift, loved your profile of him at DawgNation.com, and for me, this is a really good example or a good opportunity to kind of foray back into quarterback recruiting for a moment. We know about Carson Beck, but there's also that interest of what's next and what's the trend is with Georgia quarterback recruiting. Based on the way that Beck has talked, the way that Vandegrift has talked here, the way that Dwan Mathis has talked a little bit, they all mention Jake Fromm a bit when they talk about what they like about Georgia. They see elements of their own game in Fromm's, at least based on their public comments. Is that kind of the thing right now? Is Georgia throwing out that blanket of come here and be the next Jake Fromm? Because certainly Vandegrift seemed to say that. Carson Beck seemed to insinuate that. And Mathis himself just talked a good bit about learning from Fromm. Is the Fromm rise, is that the message and the pitch that Georgia's making right now?
Well, I think everybody knows now that, Jake Fromm is the unquestioned starter. If Jake Fromm returns for the 2020 season, I don't even think the most brash or Willie Beeman type recruit at quarterback is going to think he's going to take that man's job. And I think it's just an interesting way people view Fromm right now. Maybe it's part of the Justin Fields filter he had to go through and everything else, but I get the feeling that maybe more people won't really judge or appreciate Jake Fromm accurately, maybe until he's gone here. When you hear these recruits talk about him, they know this for a fact. He makes great decisions. He's performed well, and you got to look at it. Which young quarterback, which
quarterback in college football right now has played better on as many big stages as Jake Fromm has over the last 2 years, especially taking the reins as a freshman, right out of the gate, 2017 starter. I mean, it is very interesting that a lot of people shape their narrative and perception on Jake Fromm based simply on those Alabama games. And it's almost like, all the work he did, like a Florida game, like a Notre Dame game, like an Oklahoma game, like the second Auburn game. Nobody brings up those performances. It all comes down to Georgia LSU 2018 and then Georgia Alabama 2018 and 2018 Part 2. Nobody forgets about all the, 300, those 420-foot home runs he hit and a lot of other starts for the Bulldogs.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, he's made himself better in both of his years as a Georgia starter, and as we talked about yesterday, I mean, the people outside the bubble of DawgNation continue to treat Fromm as if he has a very good chance of being a first-round pick next spring. For a lot of Georgia fans, I don't think they've quite come to reckon with that yet as maybe much as they should, that the NCAA, the national media, and others, NFL draft scouts included, seem to be treating Fromm as a potential early departure. Is Georgia set up to handle that okay if Fromm does leave after this year?
I think so. I think back to the quarterback evolution of the position, they would have a guy in Stetson Bennett that would be around as well. And if, Dwan Mathis, high upside guy, let's just say that, high ceiling, high upside guy. You got to remember, Georgia, a post-Fromm Georgia still includes two quarterbacks that were rated among the top 12 in the country at their position, and those guys would only be in their second or first year of eligibility. That's a pretty good quarterback depth chart outlook to think about right there when you look at how things set up there with Fromm in Georgia. And again, you listen to some of this combine talk coming out, Brandon, about what the NFL guys look for. They look for, and it's almost a hierarchy now, where they look for, the number one thing they look for would be leadership ability, because they expect everybody that's going to get a look by the Sunday league to have the arm strength and enough RPMs on their ball. So then the filter factors for them is leadership ability, and that's coming into situations, winning over teams, winning over locker rooms. Number two is decision-making. That's the all-important quarterback IQ test. Do you know where you want to go with the football? Do you put the football where your coaches want you to put it and advise you and trust you to put it? That's number two. Already those are two very, very, very big check marks for Jake Fromm. And then the third one is accuracy, and that's, can you put the ball where you want it to on the field? Can you put the ball where you need it on the field? And that's an example where Fromm throws guys open, or he throws the ball where guys can catch it, a catchable ball, and then they can run with it. I think when you're evaluating Fromm for Sundays, for beyond Saturday and on to Sundays, those are three very big things right now that will work in Jake Fromm's favor.
All right, let's finish up with this for our audience watching on video, and for those who are listening, radio or podcast. I'll do my best to describe this. You should also check out Jeff Sintel on Twitter to see this for yourself. So we were at the Marlows in Brookhaven last week. Great experience, and at the very end of the afternoon, to kind of cap it all off, what had been just a tremendous tasting experience, lots of entrees, some cocktails, and kind of everything in between, it was time for dessert. They brought the creme brulee, but then they were going to let us, and not like a really good chef would, use the open flame to kind of put the crust on the top of our creme brulee. They taught us how to do that. Jeff, you did it. I did it. You captured my experience on video. You put out the survey. This may be the only time I go head-to-head against you and take the W, but I believe, according to the audience, at least at last check, I was considered the winner for the I don't even know what you call this, putting the crust on the creme brulee. I got to tell you, Jeff, I really enjoyed having the flamethrower, or I don't even know what you call the device. It's basically just a thing that shoots out flames, and I cooked up the final stages of my creme brulee. That was a very satisfying experience, Jeff, if I do admit.
Well, first of all, it's a power trip, because you get that big blowtorch there, and you feel like you're your action figure from 1980s G.I. Joe, 1990s G.I. Joe land. And then it's also, you get coached up before, and the chef, all those chef-inspired menus there at Marlowe's, they told us, you want to get it a little brown. You want to even it up across both sides. And Brandon, the people have spoken, and I am a democratic person above all else. And I think I'm willing to concede the race right there. You bruleed far better than I did on that day, sir. The people have spoken, and you are now the title belt holder. When you were growing up, you never thought you'd hold the DawgNation title belt for cooking a creme brulee, man, but you've earned it. And, one other thing we didn't get into about Marlowe's, Brandon, besides wearing those chef coats, which makes everybody feel about like they're the play callers at the University of Florida, they feel so smart, is that you also have, talk about what hit you in the mouth a little bit, Brandon. For me, like a 3-star Jordan Davis showing up on the line in the Florida game. What about those chickpea fries, man, that just caught you in the mouth, and all of a sudden you're like, hold on, Marlowe's added that to their menu for the spring, along with all those chef-inspired cocktails. It was a great, great time, and I love getting the Brandon Adams treatment, walking around Marlowe's that day. It was a fun experience for both of us.
Here's the other thing I've discovered. If I'm ever going to give way to mania, I think a pyromaniac would actually be a fairly good choice. if I ever just sacrifice the remaining fragments of my sanity, holding that open flame in my hand, I got to tell you, that wasn't a bad experience whatsoever. Jeff, what's also a really good experience is both being with you at Marlowe's Tavern last week and being here for the Marlowe's Tavern Tell-All right now. We appreciate your candid comments on UGA recruiting. We'll look forward to reading a bunch from you at DawgNation.com as well. And then tomorrow afternoon, 3 p.m. for Before the Hedges, presented by Kroger. Some more recruiting talk. Can't get enough of that this time of year, and we appreciate that. We'll look forward to speaking to you then.
Hey, Brandon, we'll have to get the blowtorch graphic going about which recruits are heating up and which parts of enemy rivals' schedules now look like a blazing dumpster fire.
Yeah, I can only imagine what human resources would say if we brought one of those blowtorches into DawgNation World Headquarters. My guess is we'd be sent back out the door as quickly as we came in.
Maybe not, sir. Always enjoyed talking to you, man. Have a great day.
All right, see you soon.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, so what Jeff is too polite to say is that based on the instructions from the Marlowe chef, he actually did his better than mine because he put like a black char on his, kind of like a marshmallow at a campfire or something like that. That's what the chef told him to do. I probably didn't hold mine down enough, but visually it just kind of looked better, so that's how I ended up winning the award. What's funny is, if you're watching a video, the people in the background are like, why is this Yahoo holding this flame here, and do we need to run out of here before he sets the whole restaurant on fire? But it was an awesome, awesome experience, and the food could not have been better, and the craft cocktails, the care they take in each individual item, just a tremendous experience. It's one of the reasons why Jeff and I are such huge fans of Marlowe's Tavern. A great week for us last week. Got the SEC through coming here. I want to talk some more about what you may have seen yesterday about Georgia's win total being announced by one of the online sports books, and we'll give away some Road to Atlanta t-shirt before we're done today, too. So that's all coming up. Let me quickly remind you, though, about our friends at Online Trading Academy. Listen, this is the time of your life when you're thinking about investing and, hey, what's the best decision you can make? Well, here's what I do know. There are a lot of different investing decisions you could make, but the first thing is invest in yourself, because the knowledge you bring in is going to impact every investment you make beyond that. So the best way to do that is with my friends at Online Trading Academy, because what Online Trading Academy is going to do is going to give you a couple different ways to learn online in the classroom, and then they're going to cover essentially the full spectrum of trading and investing, asset classes, and different kinds of ways to invest your money in the market. It's the kind of thing that is really invaluable information, and you need to check it out for yourself. Go to tradingacademy.com/Atlanta. That's tradingacademy.com/Atlanta, and make the decision to invest in yourself today. All right, here on the SEC Through, I thought CBS Sports had an interesting piece of potential breakout stars for college football in 2019, and this is what kind of also was on my mind a bit when we talked about Andrew Thomas off the top of the program, because Barton Simmons was the writer on this, and one of the names that he mentions as a potential breakout star, not just in the SEC, but in all of college football in general, was Alex Leatherwood, who is legitimately a really good offensive lineman for the Alabama Crimson Tide. If you go back and watch the 2017 National Championship game, Alabama played a lot of true freshmen there that day. Tua Tagovailoa gets a lot of the credit, but Leatherwood playing the way that he did was also, I think, a pretty big boost for Alabama in that 2017 National Championship game against Georgia. So it's probably not wrong to single him out as a potential breakout guy for this season. But to mention him and not mention Andrew Thomas, which Barton Simmons didn't. I'm sure Barton's a Thomas fan, but he mentions Leatherwood instead of Thomas. I think this is an example of what the Football Writers Association pointed out on Twitter, which I mentioned off the top of the program. Because Alabama has historically been in the mix for these interior offensive line awards, there's an assumption that Leatherwood, following the footsteps of Jonah Williams, is just going to be the next great offensive lineman in the SEC. When really, the big breakout guy who's already really good but about to make himself a household name in the NFL draft and with national awards, I do believe is Andrew Thomas. I think that the game for him is already there, and now the reputation is going to get built around that. I just think that, as a Georgia fan, I've gotten really kind of used to and had a really good time with these award ceremonies where Baker takes home the Thorpe Award or Roquan takes home the Buckus Award. I'd love to see Andrew Thomas be that next guy. I think that he could be the true breakout for Georgia this upcoming season. Also on this list from CBS Sports highlighting potential breakouts, I'll just focus on some of these SEC names. The LSU defensive back, the incoming freshman Derek Stingley, gets mentioned. And, listen, I still think that LSU has a chance to actually be pretty good this year. I know they lose Greedy Williams, they lose Devin White, but they're still pretty talented on defense, at least in the case of Greedy. They potentially replace him with a defensive back who could be on his way to the same kind of career. I don't think it's wrong to mention Stingley on this list really at all. And then the other SEC names that get mentioned, I want to spend just a brief moment on. Kentucky linebacker Jamar Watson comes up here, and a couple of Mississippi State defensive linemen get mentioned. Fabian Washington, Chauncey Rivers. Rivers, you'll remember, at one point in time was at Georgia. Here's what I think is interesting about the Kentucky linebacker and the two Mississippi State defensive linemen. Think about this just for a moment. Look across the entire landscape of the SEC. How many SEC fan bases right now would you say are dissatisfied with their current head coach? We go through this little stretch, every now and then. We go through this little stretch every now and then where, for the most part, SEC fans are all pretty satisfied with their coaches. And across the SEC right now, that's kind of the case. Maybe Ole Miss fans don't like Luke. He's had a little bit of an issue, but Mississippi State fans are pretty happy with Moorhead. Chad Morris, I think, given the way that he's recruited and the fact that he's brought in a couple transfer quarterbacks, Arkansas fans like that. Derek Mason's gone to bowls. Kentucky finished in the top 15. A lot of the places where you would typically think of dissatisfied, unhappy fans, for the most part, they are all pretty happy. But for those of you that pay close attention to the SEC, you know that can't last forever. And for a couple of coaches who are happy with their fan bases right now, Joe Moorhead at Mississippi State, because he's new, he's still in the honeymoon phase. Mark Stoops at Kentucky, because they had a veteran-laden team that had a pretty good year last year. Because of all of that, how they replace some of the stars they lost is going to determine how much longer fans stay happy. At Mississippi State, they got to replace Montez Sweat. They got to replace Jeffrey Simmons. And maybe Rivers and Washington are the guys that do that. But if they don't, the honeymoon for Joe Moorhead will be over. The same thing for Kentucky. So Cash Daniel and the kid that's going to go high in the NFL draft this year. Kentucky's had a lot of talent on both sides of the ball. Benny Snell at running back. Those guys are gone. How do you replace those? I guess Jamar Watson's going to be the guy that tries to do that for Mark Stoops. If the departed talent doesn't get replaced effectively, then Stoops goes from being a hero now to on a bit of a hot seat with his own fan base as well. That's the way that kind of stuff unfolds, and that's why these potential breakout stars for some of these, less heralded teams, that's why that's kind of an important thing to pay attention to. We'll make that your SEC through. Okay, here on DawgNation Daily, before we give away our Road to Atlanta t-shirt for today and announce how we're going to give away one for tomorrow, let me also take a moment to speak about BetOnline. Yesterday released some over-under totals for college football, the 2019 season. And this is always one of my favorite days, one of those corner polls that you have to get around on your way to the start of the year. I do really, really like it when you have some of these online sports books or the Vegas sports book that start making their predictions, because it just gets us feeling like it's closer to the season. They kind of generate some opinions. That's all really fun. And at first glance, if you look at what BetOnline put out, it seems like more of the same from college football in 2019 compared to what it was in 2018. This gap that exists between Alabama and Clemson and Georgia. Alabama's beaten Georgia the last 2 years. Clemson's the reigning national champion. It seems like in the mind of a lot of people, there's a separation between where they are and where Georgia is. And the odds released yesterday would seem to back that up just a bit. Georgia's over-under total of this upcoming season, you can bet that Georgia will have more or less wins than this, is 10.5. For Clemson and Alabama, it's at 11. But here's a point to consider. When you look a little deeper at this, what you realize is the gap between Georgia and Alabama and Clemson may not be quite as great as you think. Because Barrett Sallee on his Twitter feed yesterday also pointed out that on each of these bets, there's what's called a little bit of juice. In other words, you have to pay different prices for different bets. And the over bet for Georgia, winning more than 10.5 games, is actually minus 200, which on the entire board of over-under bets released by BetOnline is the highest of them all. In other words, you have to bet $200 just to win 100 back on Georgia going over the 10.5. But it sounds like the online sportsbook thinks that the closer number for Georgia may actually be 11 more so than 10, and that Georgia may be a little closer to being in an Alabama-Clemson category than some other people think. So do with that what you will, but kind of interesting to see some of the online sports books going on the record for what the 2019 season might look like. That's a fun thing to think about. All right, let's get ready to give away a Road to Atlanta t-shirt. I'll also tell you how we're going to give away today's in a moment. But first of all, to the email, which is DND T-shirts. DND stands for DawgNation Daily. DND T-shirts at gmail.com. We asked for folks to send that screen grab showing you subscribe to us on the YouTube page. A lot of you did that. We put them all together. We draw one out, and our winner for yesterday is Scott Boland. So Scott will be in touch with you coming up soon, and for all of our winners, we'll be in touch with you coming up soon. Congratulations, Scott. You have won for today our Road to Atlanta t-shirt. You may be saying, well, B.A., why are you giving away the Road to Atlanta t-shirts? Because it's the very idea that I just talked about a moment ago, that the gap between Alabama and the reigning champion Clemson's not that great right now. But for Georgia to close that gap all the way and get over that final hump, it's got to get back to Atlanta in early December. It's got to beat on the field head-to-head its arch nemesis, the Alabama Crimson Tide. And we think it also wouldn't be a bad idea to go ahead and set the Dogs up to be that number 1 seed for the college football playoff, stay in Atlanta for the Peach Bowl, maybe get a chance to finally chop down Clemson as well. Especially if Georgia and Clemson are battling head-to-head as much as they are in recruiting, might as well play head-to-head on the field, too, in a national championship game or a college football playoff. Wouldn't be a bad opportunity to do that. So congratulations, Scott. You're the Road to Atlanta t-shirt winner for yesterday. And as we get ready to wrap up here, let's also talk about how we're going to give it away today. Once again, it's a Road to Atlanta. Our t-shirt giveaways at DND T-shirts at gmail.com. DND T-shirts at gmail.com. Let's do this one because we haven't done it in a while. We love our podcast audience. We love celebrating our podcast audience. We appreciate the folks that listen audio-wise on demand each and every day. We think the most convenient way to do that is on the Apple Podcast Player. No disrespect to the Android devices. I'm sure we'll have some giveaways for them sometime soon, but the easiest way to access the program is right there in the Apple Podcast Player, at least from a podcast standpoint. So if you're an Apple Podcast subscriber, or if you'd consider becoming one as a way of winning a Road to Atlanta t-shirt, send us that screen grab of you, subscribe to the Apple Podcast Player, DawgNation Daily, and we'll draw a winner for tomorrow for a Road to Atlanta t-shirt. By the way, speaking of those lousy, stinking Gators, we talked about them earlier. 864 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. We'll see you tomorrow right back here on DawgNation Daily. And on video, time for our R.S. Andrews cool down, a great way to cool down after getting really, really heated up during the program. And Mullen definitely had me heated up a little earlier, so cooling down with R.S. Andrews is a good opportunity to do that. And I've been telling you about R.S. Andrews for a while. You know, you got a lot of things that go on with your house, and you want a dependable, trusted source to be able to help fix things when they go wrong. Well, that's why we trust R.S. Andrews, because there's so many different things they do well. It's heating and air, it's plumbing, it's electrical, and the great thing about it is if you've got an issue and you reach out to R.S. Andrews, they're going to show up, and they are going to do what they said they're going to do at the price they promised. There's no real surprises there. It's one of the reasons why I like R.S. Andrews as much as I do. As I say from time to time, they're the ones here on DawgNation Daily that we trust to play all the positions. We love our friends at R.S. Andrews. You're going to love them there as well. They bring the R.S. Andrews cool down to us every single day here on DawgNation Daily. So please check them out online at rsandrews.com. That's rsandrews.com. Just their name is the website. Especially as we head towards the warm weather season. And folks, it is here. Daylight savings time's already kicked in. We've had highs in the 60s, and I think we're heading towards 70 before the end of the week. You want that air conditioning to be working the way that it's supposed to heading into the spring and summer season. So get it tuned up with our friends at RS Andrews. Check them out online at rsandrews.com. All right, with that said, let's dive in here and let's do some questions and some comments. We'll pull up on YouTube and we'll rock and roll with those, and then on Facebook as well. I'm sure a lot of folks have a lot of things they want to say today. We'll take as many comments as we can while we can. Let me get a few of these. See what the folks on YouTube have been talking about here today. Chevron Hannah talking about the strength of Nick Chubb. Yeah, it's really impressive to think. And we talked about this with Chip Towers yesterday, and I even did a DN90 on some of what Chip had to say. You know, not only has Georgia worked on a reputation of trying to be like a running back university, as of late, it's also been that tandem of running backs. It's not just one guy in a starring role, but it's this guy and that guy. In 2017, it was the very strong Nick Chubb along with Sony Michel. Both those guys are having really good success in the NFL. And last season, it was DeAndre Swift and Elijah Holyfield stepping into the role that Chubb and Michel had been in. And now for 2019, it's still DeAndre Swift, but who's going to join him as that Chubb-Michel duo in that role that Elijah Holyfield occupied a year ago? Who's that guy going to be? And Chip made his case for Brian Herrien, but one way or another, that's something we're going to watch a lot this spring to see who that next guy is. And obviously with Chubb, the feats of strength that he showed in the weight room and on the field, and a lot of these other guys too, that's going to be a big, big part of all this. By the way, Scott Bolin in our YouTube comment section saying, I'm excited to win a T-shirt. Thank you. Scott, that's awesome. I'm really glad for you. Congratulations on that. Really cool. Really cool. Mary Clouser says if Chubb didn't get hurt, that means missing most of the 2015 season, he would have had a chance to break, I'm assuming, Herschel Walker's record for most rushing yards at Georgia. I don't know the math on that well. I don't know how close he really was. I know that Chubb basically dominates everything other than Herschel Walker. I don't know how a 2015 would have changed that. I probably should know that. I don't really know how close he really was. Connor, you got the stats up there. How close would Chubb have been had he been able to put together a 1,300-yard 2015?
So essentially doubling where he ended up at. Chubb finished second all-time in Georgia career rushing yards with, I don't think what I pulled up was correct. Passing, rushing, here we go. So he finished his career with 4,769 yards. Mm-hmm. Just a little under 500 yards behind Herschel Walker.
Okay, so Mary's right. So if he's fully healthy in 2015, having gone 1,400 yards as a freshman, it's very easy to assume that he would have gotten enough yards to pass Herschel all time.
Am I allowed to counter with, if he's healthy, he probably doesn't come back for his senior year?
That's also a really good point too. That you add to the 2015 total, but just given the way that would have likely worked out, you end up subtracting the 2017 total because he did come back with something to prove. Now, the counter to that is Chubb, what he told Kirby Smart was, hey, I need to come back so I can make a name for my NFL. I mean, if we're going to take Chubb at his word, he told Kirby Smart that he couldn't sleep at night because they'd lost to Georgia Tech and they lost some of the games they lost. And, the story, the popular narrative is Chubb came back to correct the record from some of those 2016 losses, which led to the revenge tour, which we spoke about so much on DawgNation Daily. Now, obviously, there's a story behind the story, and I'm sure a lot of that is NFL related. But Chubb, in his own words, has talked about other reasons other than just the draft for why he came back to Georgia in 2017. I think we lost Connor, but the other thing that anytime you compare Herschel Walker to like modern running backs, the other thing that I think comes up is, to me, there'll always be a difference in Herschel Walker's rushing yards compared to modern running backs' rushing yards, even for an offense like Georgia, which is still built around running backs a good bit. It's just a different thing because in this day and age, everybody throws the ball. Georgia, who is thought to throw the ball less than the college teams, compared to the 80s era college football team, Georgia might as well be the air raid offense. I mean, it's just a totally different thing. So every yard that Herschel Walker essentially ever got came when there was a stadium full of 80,000+ people that knew he was getting the football. Everybody knew he was getting the football. Every defense was designed to stop Herschel Walker, and the other great running backs at the time too, but we're talking about Herschel Walker. Every defensive player was lined up ready to stop Herschel. Every fan knew Herschel was getting the ball. He got the ball, and he still gained those yards. Even the really good running backs in this day and age, a good bit of their success comes from the fact that defenses can't key on just one thing anymore. Georgia runs out of these 3 wide receiver, sometimes probably even 4 wide receiver sets, a good bit. And when you got that kind of spread formation, all of a sudden you can't just key on stopping the run anymore, which makes running the ball a little bit easier. Doesn't mean that the top running backs aren't really good players now, but it's easier to run the football in 2019 than it was in 1980 and 81 and 82. And so I'm always a little hesitant to make the era comparison between Herschel and a modern back because it was really hard to run the football back then. Let me also say one more thing, too, off the subject, and then we'll get back to more comments as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. So last week, we talked a good bit, both on and kind of in the comment section, about the lack of honoring for Georgia greats and should the field at Sanford Stadium be named after Vince Dooley and on and on and on. And I've talked to a lot of Georgia fans about that, both kind of in official and unofficial methods. And here's the one thing that I'm hearing a good bit. It goes along these lines. There are some people who say, you know what? Vince Dooley probably does deserve to have the field named after him. Or there are people who say, hey, Dooley was a great coach, a important athletic director, an important administrator for Georgia, a pivotal figure in Georgia's history, but the stadium's already got a name. Let's just keep it the way that it is. You've heard both statements. No disrespect to Dooley. Some people just like the name the way that it is. And you've heard some people who say, yeah, given everything that went on with Vince Dooley, he probably ought to have that name. Yet there is something that adds to that seemingly almost everybody agrees with. Whether you think Dooley needs more honoring or you're kind of satisfied with the way it is right now, I haven't really heard from anyone in this comment section or in just real life. I haven't heard from anyone who doesn't think that Herschel Walker ought to be honored more than he has been. We had a thing last week, kind of half serious, half kidding, about the lack of statues for UGA. Connor, you'd be hard-pressed to run into any Georgia fan, at least based on, and I've talked to people about this a lot. For some reason, this has been a hot-button topic with me for the last few days about what Georgia has and hasn't done to honor some of its all-time greats. You'll be hard-pressed to find anybody who doesn't openly advocate for Georgia to have a statue for Herschel Walker, some sort of honoring for Herschel Walker, some sort of commemoration of the career that he had. That seems to be a thing that Georgia fans are fairly united on, and if you'll allow me to be candid, it seems to be a thing that the UGA administration is a bit tone deaf on, that there doesn't seem to be much movement nor desire to move on this from the official administration, and yet this is the kind of thing that the rank and file fan seems to care pretty strongly about.
Yeah, I think if you were to poll the average college football fan and have each one put their most iconic college football player, I feel like Herschel Walker means more to Georgia and sort of the history and everything he's done for it, maybe more than just about anyone. I mean, maybe you could put Steve Spurrier in there for Florida. There are a few instances, but it is strange that, there really isn't a whole lot honoring Walker out there at this point in time.
Yeah, I think it is pretty strange. On a slightly different subject, Ronald Watson on YouTube, who's not a Georgia fan, but we still welcome his comments anyway, says that he thinks when he looks at Georgia for this upcoming season, he thinks the story with DeAndre Swift is more key than the story with Jake Fromm. I think it's an interesting debate to be had for a couple of different reasons. If Swift is a more significant storyline than Fromm, I think that's due to the fact that last year, staying completely healthy and staying at 100% was something that DeAndre Swift dealt with. If Swift is 100%, then he is a given. You know pretty much exactly what to expect from him. And that's exactly what Georgia's counting on. He'll be an elite running back. We can debate if running backs can still win the Heisman, but somewhere in that national conversation, like Travis Etienne has been for Clemson, of really, really good back who's a really big part of a team's success. DeAndre Swift is something of a given. I think that Jake Fromm, at least from the vantage point of who is nationally elite, I think is a little bit less of a given. We know that Jake Fromm is a really good quarterback. But what 2019 for me is about can Fromm take the next step towards being a truly great quarterback, a quarterback that could be a Heisman finalist, a quarterback that could lead a team bearing more responsibility than he probably than he bore in 2017? Can Fromm put that team on his back, get into the college football playoff? Can he depart after 2019 as a first-round draft pick on his way to the NFL? The ceiling for Fromm is potentially higher because I think that DeAndre Swift has already proven himself to be great. Therefore, Georgia fans have kind of penciled him in as a bit of a given. But if Georgia can win a national championship, I think that Jake Fromm is going to take another step towards developing. He's already really good, but he probably needs to be great. He probably needs to take one more step. And I know it's a terrible cliche about being an elite quarterback, but the fact is, elite quarterbacks are a thing. And Jake Fromm is probably knocking on the door of being an elite quarterback. But if Georgia wins the title in 2019, he's probably got to kick in that door, kick through the door and walk in and proclaim himself that. So if you give me the choice of bigger story for Georgia this upcoming season, given what Georgia's chasing, it's probably more so Fromm than Swift for the reasons that I just said, but other people can weigh in on that as a part of our R.S. Andrews cool down. Robert Barnes, this is an interesting take. He says, I'll say it again. I think the city of Athens and Clark County should get together and have a park where they honor UGA grades. This is kind of interesting, that if Georgia is going to cede statues to somebody else, maybe the local government should just step in and do that, because let's not forget, the University of Georgia and the Athens-Clark County municipality are not the same thing. They're separate entities. There's on-campus land, there's public land. And I don't really know about the branding issues associated with statues. I don't know who owns the likeness for a statue when it comes to something like that. But maybe Athens, the city, should do that if Georgia, the university, is not going to. I think it'd be a bad look for Georgia to give up that ground to somebody else. But that's a pretty good point. Phil Rogers says, BA on August 31st against Vandy, that's the season opener, we could see three backs rush for 300 yards against them. That'd be fun to see. Could Georgia have more of a three-headed monster this year? The 2017 model was, Chubb and Michelle, like this really, really great tandem, and DeAndre Swift kind of, significantly below that in that third spot. Now, Swift would come in and give you the roundhouse punch. He showed a lot of athleticism late in the Notre Dame game, was really tough for the Irish to deal with, and he did the same thing against Auburn in the SEC championship. But in the college football playoff, for instance, this was the Chubb and Michelle show, and we didn't see as much of DeAndre Swift back at the end of the 2017 season. Could the 2019 year, because of maybe a healthier Zamir White and maybe what Chip said about Brian Harry, and for those people who want to, vouch for James Cook, could this be more of a three-headed monster for Georgia at running back? That'd be interesting. That'd be interesting to think about. James Bryant says the park idea is good, but statues are too much. So I love James. He's one of our great commenters. I don't understand why people are Scrooges about statues. Who would not want to see a Herschel Walker statue? Who would not want that? Steve Banks says, if we remain a run-first offense, it's going to be difficult for Fromm to reach the elite passing yardage the pundits look for. Steve, I understand where you're coming from on this, but let me kind of share with you where I come from on this. Let me see if I can pull this up quickly. It's always difficult for me to do on the fly. So if we go to a cfbstats.com, which is a really good website for very easily and quickly paying attention to stats, I think most people would probably think of Tua Tagovailoa as an elite quarterback. I think when he didn't play always his best against the best defenses that he saw a year ago, but he is generally treated as an elite quarterback. Fairly or unfairly, that's kind of the thing. And naturally, my computer's going to go slow. But what I'm going to show you, hopefully, when we get this. All right, here we go. So here are the Alabama stats from a year ago. Actually, let me do this. So Tua goes for everything he did on 245 completions. He threw 43 touchdowns on 355 attempts. But if you look at the overall rushing totals for Alabama, they ran the ball. Now, this is going to include sacks, too, so that's going to be a little bit incorrect. But they ran the ball 571 times. Now, compare that to Georgia for a moment. And I'll try not to make this too convoluted. If you look at Georgia, the total rushing attempts for Georgia, which is also going to include sacks here, is 567. So Georgia and Alabama are essentially right there in terms of the total number of rushing attempts, and yet on a few more passing attempts, Tua Tagovailoa was able to make the difference-making throws that made Alabama, I think in the minds of the average college football fan, a much more dangerous offense. Now, it was close. Georgia's pretty good offensively itself, but in terms of dangerous, exciting, threat, whatever you want to say it, Alabama kind of had that reputation. I don't think it takes a ton more throws for Jake Fromm to get there. As I've been saying a lot this offseason, for me it's 4 more attempts per game. And of those 4 additional attempts, I need 2 of them to be deep completions, 20 or more yards down the field. If Fromm can add just that to what he's already done thus far in his Georgia career, you don't have to sacrifice the running game. You don't have to change the overall identity of the offense. Just add a little bit more. All of a sudden, Fromm, he grows in stature. The Georgia offense looks a little bit more like what's won national championships in recent years. And that, I think, could be the recipe for getting Georgia where it wants to go. Back over here on Facebook, Travis Ellis brings up a good point that Tua did play a lot less snaps than Fromm did a year ago, and that's a fair point. He wasn't playing a lot in fourth quarters, but nonetheless, the numbers are what they are. Brandon Vernon also talking about, Brandon Jacobs, the Alabama running back, going to use that to the tune of a successful draft season. Jalen Jackson says the Alabama route concepts for the wide receivers are different. Their receivers are all home run hitters, which makes Tua's numbers better. So they do have those home run guys, but Jalen, this is also something we've talked about on our program, which is the need for Georgia to find out who its home run guy is going to be. Fromm's going to make the home run throw, and Georgia's going to have the guys that run those home run routes. And that means creating that separation. That's the one thing we haven't seen a ton from the Georgia receivers the last couple of years. I think one of the things that J.J. Holman's really good at doing is going up and high-pointing a football. He's got strong hands. He can pull the thing out of the air. I think that Javon Wims in 2017 was good at using his tall frame to turn and position himself and make big catches. But when's the last time you saw a Georgia player run away from a defensive back? That's how you become a home run threat at wide receiver, and that's why Georgia fans are still hopeful and excited about Demetrius Robertson, why George Pickens has gotten so much attention, Dominic Blaylock a bit too, because between that trio, the hope is that somebody becomes that home run wide receiver, and that's not just jumping up and catching the football, but it's also putting yourself so wide open that you make an easy throw and catch combination. To me, that's going to be really important. Hasheem Spikes also touting Tyler Simmons, and Simmons is going to have his chance. Levon Webb says McCole Hardman. I think with all due respect, I think Hardman was certainly fast enough to do that. I'm not so sure how often Hardman really did do that during games, though. But there's no doubt he had the blazing speed. But I mean, how many individual moments do you really remember from McCole Hardman? Let me get Nick Lurch's comment here. Nick says, Sanford Dooley Field. Pardon me. He says, how about the Sanford Dooley Field Herschel Walker Recruitment Center? That's a lot of names there, Nick, but I kind of like that. It's not bad. Matt Rukavina's checking in, standing in line to check bags. Is Matt the one that says he's going to Alaska? Is he the one that's going? Safe travels, Matt. Thanks for checking in here from the airport. We appreciate that. I know that's not always a very easy experience, but we appreciate you checking on the program. Michael Webb says when it comes to home run guys, about Demetrius Robertson, Kyrus Jackson, George Pickens, and he also mentioned Jackson doing some of that work from the slot. I think that's a really interesting thing to think about for sure. Miriam Martin Corbin, who's also not a top fan, says, why is Matt not a top fan? Yeah, honestly, like there are a lot of people who are not top fans that it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Like a lot of things with Facebook, it just doesn't make a ton of sense. Just doesn't make a ton of sense, some of that kind of stuff. I mean, of all the Facebook ideas, Connor, this is one of the ones that probably stands out among the worst.
It's just, I think it's a ploy by the YouTube audience to try and divide.
I think so.
Divide our Facebook audience.
Yeah, I think so. Steve Highland also says if McCole was 4 inches taller, he would be that guy, and no doubt a little bit of extra height would have helped him there in that regard. And I think that the thing about McCole is is he made something look easy that's actually pretty hard. He went from being kind of one of those, Wildcat-style quarterbacks at Elbert County, just snapping the ball and then make something happen, to trying defensive back for a year. I always said in 2016 that was a good and worthy experiment. Had that worked out, McCole Hardman may have made himself, $100 million playing the position in the NFL. These lockdown cornerbacks make a lot of money. It didn't. That didn't really stick with him. So the very next year, he learned wide receiver. He learned it well enough, quick enough, that you would have assumed he'd been playing wide receiver his entire life, but he hadn't been. That was a position he had to grow to play. So some of the occasional drops you would have seen from him were all just a byproduct of the fact that he was learning how to play that position. I think it's one of those things, had he started with elite training, working with a guy like Terrence Edwards, for instance, had he started doing that when he was 14 or 15 years old, there's no telling what kind of wide receiver he could have been by 2017. He was already a good one in just very short work and very short order. But becoming a receiver is not as easy as Hardman made it look. And when you evaluate his career at Georgia, I think that's important to remember, is that he was an athlete that was turned into a wide receiver. That's just a very different thing from a guy who's working on that footwork and even timing leaps, knowing how to, go up and high point the football. All of those aspects are specific skills that are trained over time, and Hardman had to pick those up on the fly. He had to cram for that test. That's a difficult thing to do.
Cliff Jordan Wells with the comment of the day today.
All right.
Says, Rivals has Mary Martin Corbin and Matt Rugavina as top fans. They're just not top fans in the closet.
Oh, that's good. I like that from Philip. Good stuff there.
Let's go back to the top of the show.
Please.
We're talking about Dan Mullen.
Yeah, we haven't done that on the comment section, the R.S. Andrews cool down. Let's do that for a minute.
So I'm going through my rewatch of Game of Thrones right now.
Uh-huh.
Excellent show. I'm trying to get BA to watch it. He's gonna say there are just too many characters going on.
Can I call timeout for a second?
You can't call timeout.
Is this really true? John Chappell says, I'm beginning to regret turning down my top fan badge. Is this true that John got offered one and did not accept it? That's kind of interesting if that's true.
I don't know.
Actually, John, I think the fact that you're like, I don't need a top fan badge, I think that actually speaks pretty well for you. I think that speaks pretty well for you. I started to cut you off, but if you really did turn down a top fan badge,
that means he's very comfortable in who he is as a fan.
Yeah, listen, I appreciate that.
All credit to that.
I appreciate that, but please make your point.
We're going through our rewatch of Game of Thrones, and I'm going to try and get BA to start watching it. Excellent show. He will love it. He's just probably going to say there are too many characters, there's too much going on in the start, and I'm just saying just power through.
No, I've seen everything but the most recent season.
Oh, you have? You're
Yeah, no, I'm not like an expert on the Game of Thrones folklore. As you said, there are a lot of characters that I don't, probably know their whole backstory, but I know White Walkers and, Targaryen. I've seen everything but the most recent season.
Okay.
So I'm not a total rube when it comes to Game of Thrones. I'm just by no means a Game of Thrones expert.
Okay. So then I'm still probably going to lose you here for a bit.
Sure.
Dan Mullen reminds me a lot of Bruce Bolton.
Okay.
And you probably don't remember who Bruce Bolton is. He is the guy who plays a pivotal role in portraying Robb Stark at the Red Wedding. And I'm not spoiling spoilers for the Red Wedding. If you haven't seen the Red Wedding by now, I just can't help it. He's perceived as kind of a smart guy, but he's also just taking shots for whatever reason, and he's not really thinking about the big picture. He's thinking about the small picture in the meantime.
Yeah.
And I just, Ruse was ultimately done in by his own son, who had much bigger plans than he is. And I do wonder if Mullen's worried about taking shots about Georgia and its recruitment and how it handles 5-star quarterbacks. I would think at some point the Florida fan base is going to want to see Mullen land a 5-star quarterback of his own, especially when he has this reputation of being a quarterback developer, whisperer, whatever you want to use.
Yeah, so I'll do my best to not make too clumsy of a Game of Thrones reference, but which is the house that talks about paying the iron price versus the gold price?
That would be the Greyjoys.
All right, so if you're not a Game of Thrones person, basically...
I also did consider Dan Mullen as your on Greyjoy.
Yeah, so... The point here is that if you've got something that came to you, did you use the sword to get it or did you just buy it? And basically the thought is if you pay the iron price, you use the sword to earn it, then you are somehow of a better stature than someone who just bought something fancy to go along their way. That to me is what Dan Mullen really is. He's the kind of guy that's paid the gold price for everything that he had. You know, he was the coach at Mississippi State where winning the occasional game made him the darling of the media. And the media created this narrative at Mississippi State that somehow Mullen was the best coach in the SEC because the media doesn't like saying Nick Saban's the best coach in the SEC. Now it's Kirby Smart. They don't like giving credit to the person that's really at the top because to them that's not a very interesting opinion. So you go a few rungs down the ladder. The media will always be enamored by the thought of doing more with less because their perception is, the Blue Check Brigade, national writers, everybody else, their perception is it makes them look smart to like guys who do more with less. So as long as you're a coach who's doing more with the less, the media is going to love you. The media loved Dan Mullen at Mississippi State. The problem, though, is that once you come to a place like Florida and all of a sudden the gift you've been given of media attention, now you can't do more with less anymore. Now you got to do more with more. You've actually got to win at kind of a blue blood program that expects to do that. But here's Mullen once again. It's paying the gold price instead of paying the iron price. He thinks because he's at Florida, he's just going to inherit this success. What has Dan Mullen ever done that he's actually really earned for himself? The easiest answer is, well, he made Dak Prescott into a quarterback. Have you seen Dak Prescott with the Dallas Cowboys as of late? I'm not quite so sure that's going to be the first line on Mullen's Wikipedia page when his career is all said and done.
I'm the wrong guy to ask about Dak Prescott because I just don't think he's a very good quarterback. Playoff wins.
Yeah.
Regardless, I just don't think.
As of late, I would say that Dak Prescott as your shining achievement, I would say that's not looking so great right now.
Mullen in his career at Mississippi State, I believe he's 0-9 against Nick Saban.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as great as a coach is, the perception that he is, I would have liked to have seen if he's as good as the perception about him is, you would think he would have beaten Saban once. I mean, Kevin Sumlin was able to do it, Hugh Freeze was able to do it, and Mullen never did it.
I like Steve Shaffini's comment on Facebook who says, I thought last year the media went out of their way to pretend the SEC championship game was going to be anybody other than Georgia versus Alabama. Remember when LSU and Kentucky had a chance? And I think Steve's right about this. And we tried to make this point earlier. I think some of what feeds Dan Mullen into thinking that he can give Kirby Smart advice about how to recruit quarterbacks is the fact that Mullen hears the media once again because it's motivated in the hopes that the league won't be boring, that you're not going to just rubber stamp Georgia's SEC East champion every single year. They're begging Florida to be good. Last year, as Steve points out, late in the season, begging Kentucky to be for real, begging, as he mentions, LSU to beat Alabama. And for the most part, none of this stuff happens. The SEC seasons are foregone conclusions by the time the games are played because it's who practices the hardest and who recruits the best. That's what determines who wins. Well, Florida's not practicing as hard as Georgia. They've got a bunch of their practices open for fans this spring. They essentially turn a lot of their their practices into circus sideshows. Georgia is getting after it black and blue at full contact and bloody. That's not fit for fans to see in some case. So a lot of that kind of stuff for Georgia goes on behind closed doors. And goodness knows, signing a whole slew of 3-star prospects from Lakeland is not the same thing as Georgia going across the country to collect, 5 stars stacked on top of 5 stars. So I think that Steve's right about this, and I try to make the point that Mullen and Florida are living off the steam of the national media saying Florida's back and this is the year. But as I showed you earlier in the show, it's the same thing. Some of the same kinds of writers were saying a year ago, and it's not. It's just as much of a lie now as it was before the 2018 season. This is wishful thinking, and Georgia exists to ruin wishful thinking.
I will say, I think this makes the Georgia Mullen running his mouth. I think that makes the Georgia-Florida rivalry better. We saw. Yeah,
you wrote about this, and I like the take. I do.
We saw in 2018 Kirby show a lot more emotion than he traditionally does for a Georgia win. I think that's a good thing. You think you'd like to see that a little bit more out of Kirby Smart. Maybe not hold the card so close to his chest and show, hey, I enjoy beating this guy. I like it a lot. I want to celebrate this. I think our fans should celebrate this. I'd like to see that more out of Kirby Smart. I personally, if Smart and Mullen have a good head-to-head, I mean, Mullen's never really had any success against Smart, dating even back to Smart's time as an Alabama defensive coordinator. I think it's a good thing for Georgia, and I think on a national scale, I think this back and forth Mullen and Smart have is going to make the Georgia-Florida rivalry sort of rise to the top in terms of national college football rivalry.
I think that Connor makes a really good point about that, and I think it'd be really cool if Georgia-Florida as a rivalry had that national prestige. People think of the Iron Bowl as a super intense rivalry. Ohio State-Michigan obviously has that same cachet. I think it'd be cool if the Georgia-Florida rivalry was viewed in the same vein. And for Georgia fans, one of the things that I hope doesn't get taken for granted, one of the things I hope gets appreciated is that Georgia has a coach now. He's never going to satisfy us by saying this publicly. Kirby Smart will pretend that all games are the same. But there is enough private behavior or things that become public that were accidental seemingly. There's enough of that kind of circumstantial evidence to lead you to believe that Kirby Smart cares deeply about Georgia's rivals. He likes beating Auburn. I don't think he likes Gus Malzahn very much. We've talked about that before. Connor just laid out some reasons why it's very likely that Kirby doesn't like Dan Mullen very much. I think that Kirby has a healthy, strong distaste for Georgia Tech. You've seen some examples of that. And so if you're a Georgia fan, it remains to be seen how successful Kirby's going to end up being. Does he, win a stack of national championships the way that some people think that he can? Some people think that he should. That remains to be seen. In the moment right now, though, it is really fun having a coach that dislikes Georgia's rivals as much as Kirby does, because I do think he embodies the fan demeanor, at least privately, when it comes to Florida, Auburn, Georgia Tech, the three schools that Dog fans ought to care about the most.
Yep.
Let me do one thing real quick. We're going to get ready to get out of here. I'll do a couple more YouTube comments, too, because I haven't been there in a while. Ricky Jett says something kind of interesting. He says that right now Dan Mullen is, quote, a little better than Jim McElwain. And I don't think that Ricky Jett's wrong about that. I don't, Florida fans want to believe that Mullen is way better than McElwain because of how it ended. But if you look at the totality of McElwain at Florida, the totality of Mullen at Florida, I think that Ricky is correct to say that Mullen is only a little bit better.
Yeah. Florida signed the number 9 class this year. How much better than that really is the number 11 class when Mullen signed, I think, his last year before he got fired. There are a lot of similarities there. Now, Mullen obviously has a lot more cachet given his time at Mississippi State, but there are, Florida, as well as its recruiting, it's still a clear step and maybe even 2 below the elite SEC teams, which is the teams that it's expected to beat and go against.
All right, a couple of YouTube comments. Mike D on this same subject. One thing that's irrefutably true, Mullen's teeth are wider than Jim McElwain, so you got to give him a little credit for that. A little more polished enamel. I mean, that counts. Jacob Thompson says, to go back to our Game of Thrones discussion from a moment ago, he heard that Eddie Gran was offered a role on Game of Thrones but turned it down. That's how much Eddie Gran loves Kentucky. If y'all don't take anything from this offseason, Eddie Gran loves the Bluegrass State. He wants everybody to know how much he loves the state of Kentucky. So Gran is a hero in his own mind there in Kentucky. So he's not taking roles on Game of Thrones. He's not taking roles on Georgia's offense. This guy loves Kentucky. Last thing, we'll make this kind of semi-serious. Dean Butler, Levon Webb both talk about the steps they want to see Kirby Smart take in his 4th year as head coach. And is there some better on-field stuff you need from Kirby? Maybe there is. I think the overall strategy of how you run a program really matters for Kirby Smart. I think that encompasses what you do on 4th and 11 with Justin Fields on the field, but also encompasses how you handle quarterback situations if Jake Fromm were to decide to depart from the program. As much as I said earlier that Justin Fields bears some responsibility for choosing to compete with Jake Fromm, Kirby Smart also allowed that to take place, and you can debate amongst yourself if Georgia's better or worse because of that. So, a couple commenters say, I want to see Kirby be a better game coach. I think the next step of Kirby's development towards does he really become a next Nick Saban-like figure is his overall strategy of how he manages the program, who he chooses to recruit, who he refrains from recruiting, what he does on game day, what he does week to week during practice. I think there are a lot of buttons that get pushed by a head coach that go beyond just in-game decision-making.
Yeah, just overall sharpness. You saw in the Texas game, Georgia just came out flat, didn't really come to play. Even in the LSU game, Georgia was conservative in a way beyond just, we're not going to go for it on 4th and 3 on the opponent's side of the field. Conservative just in a way they went about managing that game. And you do want to see maybe Kirby ratchet up, the aggressiveness for the big games like that, especially early on.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point to end on, because as much as the non-Georgia fan gives Dog fans grief about the two, close losses to Alabama recently, the biggest blight on Kirby's resume is not coming up short against Alabama, even though his own decision-making probably hurt Georgia a bit in the 2018 game. The biggest blight on Kirby's Georgia resume is not showing up at Auburn in 2017 and not showing up at LSU in 2018. Those games bordered on being uncompetitive, and that's the one thing. If you're looking for growth from Kirby Smart as a coach, you can't get beat bad on the road this year. I mean, the
Kirby Smart's lost a road game against an SEC opponent, SEC West opponent every single year. He's beaten Georgia by at least. So you got to see that go.
That's what's going to change. The over-under total from Bet Online, 10.5, with a little juice on the over, would suggest that Smart Money thinks Georgia's going to lose at some point in time. That can happen, and Georgia can be fine no matter who it loses to. You just can't get beat bad on the road because, as we saw last year, the media will hold that against you. All right, we have got to go. Really good stuff. Thanks for being a part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Huge thanks to R.S. Andrews for making it all possible. Heating, air, plumbing, electric. Check them out online at rsandrews.com. They'll show up. They'll do the work that's requested. The price that you talked about before. No surprises. Just good stuff. So give Dari and the gang a call there at RS Andrews online at rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for another episode of DawgNation Daily Live.